Hello and welcome. Thank you for your company. I want to talk about the Minnesota shootings and some issues that lie behind them that I don't think have had much public exposure, and particularly from a Catholic point of view. But can I ask you, please, to like and subscribe, and above all, to consider joining and subscribing to the Substack in the comment, the introduction below. Thank you very much. Of course, each of us live in great fear of school shootings in America, fear of the news, fear of the death, fear of suffering, fear of what it might portend, fear of escalation. And any reflection on these issues runs the risk of appearing to show insufficient respect in the face of tragic and unnecessary death, especially of children. But we do have to reflect. Much of the reflection we want to have gets buried in political rhetoric about gun law, as one side, always the Democrats in these cases, tries to make as much political capital out of the tragedy as possible. And the rhetoric always follows the same pattern. I'm sure you've noticed. The left says, look at this execrable tragedy. If we didn't have guns in our society, these shootings wouldn't happen. Let's get rid of all guns. And to which the right replies, these guns don't shoot themselves. It's the shooters that are the cause, not the guns. Let's think more about the shooters. Well, this is something of a sterile argument. There's some right on both sides, of course. It's an argument which, in its political playground form, hides the fact there are much more complex issues at work, which I hope will arise from this conversation we're having. There's a framework in which the tedious argument it's set in isn't often reflected on. It's got to do with why the left hate guns so much and use every opportunity to blame gun ownership for whatever, as a social phenomenon, for whatever tragedy has taken place. Of course, the suggestion is that if you're on the left, you're a nice person and you wouldn't want to hurt people. On the right are violent and more primeval and primitive. The reality, of course, is that's appallingly superficial. We know from the left that the politics of the left is that as the society becomes more politically ambitious and totalitarian, they lock up people who disagree with them, and after locking them up, they send them to the Gulags. We mustn't forget that Mao Zedong killed 80 to 100 million people and Stalin something like 40 to 60 million. That's what the left do. They're not nice people in that sense. Rather, whatever the people are like, the idea that possesses them, as Jordan Peterson would say, is not nice at all. So, at one level, however, we agree with the left. Guns have been an instrument that allows killers to murder victims, and so we need to control guns to some extent and who might have them. It's stupid to let teenagers buy automatic weapons that they don't need and will cause damage. But that's not the same thing as banning all gun ownership. Obviously, at the same time, we can't blame the guns as if they were to some degree animate, because they're not. They are, in fact, the symptoms of a different argument, which doesn't break surface, at least in this form. It's a struggle between the state with totalitarian ambitions and the resistance of individuals or communities to these statist ambitions. It wasn't long ago, it was only a matter of a couple of years, that the FBI was spying on conservative Catholics, having designated them as threats to the state. Last month, Congress heard that a report revealed that, contrary to the testimony of former FBI Director Christopher Wray, the 2023 Richmond Memorandum that derisively labeled traditional Catholics as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists wasn't an isolated one. New documents obtained show that in fact, there was a lot more surveilling of Catholics than anybody knew. There was, for example, the Richmond field office's targeting of Catholics extended to surveilling a priest, coordinating other field offices nationally and even internationally, which included the FBI headquarters and the FBI in London. So anyone in London having to do with this priest may very well have found the FBI treating them as a radical potential extremist. In addition, several internal FBI documents used derogatory terms like radical, traditionalist, Catholic between 2009 and 2023, a long time, in fact. An FBI internal database contained at least 13 documents, including the Richmond Memorandum that used all of these terms, all of which cited the far-left Southern Poverty Law Center, a serious player in these affairs. So then, not just American Catholics being treated by the FBI as potential social extremists, perhaps you and me too, but setting aside our own tender capacities for paranoia, except of course it's not paranoia when they actually are out to get you, this makes Catholics into enemies of left-leaning American administrations like the latest Biden one. Well, Catholics are used to being treated as an enemy of the state. When you look at the history of the 20th century, the totalitarian left makes the Catholic Church one of its very first targets. Nevertheless, this goes some way to explaining the relief of Catholics in America and elsewhere. J.D. Vance is one, and under any regime he's part of, we will not be treated as enemies of the state. Meanwhile, the Biden FBI designations of traditional Catholics as radical Catholics, as if we were political extremists, is indicative of how thin the ice we stand on is. Boiled down, what this suggests is that the left don't like guns because the left is more likely, for dogmatic reasons, to want to develop a degree of statist control over its citizens than the right is. The left deny it, but that doesn't make it untrue. So what this infers is that the gun debate that has erupted, as always after the shooting, has very little to do with the deaths of the children or any real proposal to deal with the phenomena of these killings in the States, in schools or elsewhere, but are instead a continuation of a political struggle the left sees as more important even than the deaths of children, which is the ambition to exercise administrative governmental control over its citizens and to stop the citizens being able to resist by having guns. Some of my American friends have reflected in conversations we've had, Gavin, what are you going to do in the UK when the Labour government turns the screw one more time over thought crime and censorship and you find yourself living in a fully fledged totalitarian state? Just yesterday there was a demonstration about illegal immigration in Epping, mainly driven by our wonderful English women, and a small slight woman climbed the council house steps to drape the flag of St. George over it. She was immediately grabbed by 4 burly, tough policemen in riot gear, hustled into a police van and arrested. She hasn't been seen since. Normally, you'd expect a citizen to be able to climb up the steps of the town council, but apparently the police had applied for a public order which made it out of bounds or illegal, so she got arrested. In fact, this idea of violence can, or the need for guns, can actually extend much further. What happens, I'm asked, if violence erupts between scores of hundreds of thousands of Muslims of military age, many of whom were trained combatants under the Taliban and other Islamic militant units? What happens when fighting breaks out between them and indigenous Englishmen? And when up to 80,000 of them take to the streets of Britain fully armed? And why might they be fully armed? Because it turns out that in the news we have regular reports of the police stopping shipments of weapons being smuggled in from Dover, heading for, well, they never tell us where they're heading for, but there's no reason to think that they're going to Tommy Robinson or Nigel Farage. And we know, because we've been told, that one of the latest tranches of illegal immigration contained a large number of Taliban fighters. So it would be silly not to imagine the possibility of them being armed. And we need also to remember that I think it's 43% of the Muslims in this country, a number that grew by 1 million through illegal immigration a couple of years ago. 43% want Sharia law, which is, of course, totalitarianism. So we're faced by a growing totalitarianism from the left, which the present government is imposing in a more intense way every week, and a prospect of a local, at least to begin with, perhaps later on a national totalitarianism by the imposition of Sharia law from what we might call the Islamic right. Gun control for the left, then, is a prerequisite for ensuring that the citizenship have no means of defending them when the state turns hostile, as it is. What if we discussed the tragedy of school shootings, because that's what I want to move on to now, without being diverted by gun control, which is a debate that I think belongs somewhere else. It's not about saving kids. We might find ourselves giving our attention to the deeply demanding area of the crossover between mental illness and evil, which is hardly dealt with by anybody. Gun control is much easier to wrangle over, especially since it's a diversion. Interpreting the subtle and multi-layered gradations between mental distress and human dysfunction and the reality of metaphysical evil is much harder. We have politicized a mental illness, gender dysphoria, and in so doing, we've removed it from the category of mental illness where it belongs into the contested area of human rights and victimhood where it doesn't belong. Part of the ethical and metaphysical analysis of the Church is that suffering from being mentally unwell makes the task of holding a defense against the subtleties of evil, the ethically disguised whispers of temptation, so much more difficult for someone who's suffering from mental instability than it is when one is, relatively speaking, sane and well balanced. So maybe it's no surprise that 6 of the recent shooting of innocent tragedies have involved perpetrators, 4 of whom were trans, 1 cross-dresser, and 1 extra non-binary. This is not to demonize any class of persons, but only to observe that the mentally ill are less well defended against the temptation to succumb to rage, to bitterness, to a misplaced sense of injustice, and end up killing their innocent neighbours. So what's the Catholic response to all this? Well, there's nothing direct anyone can do to forestall an event that can't easily be predicted, but it is clear that mental ill health accompanies the decline of religious belief. Society has tried to avoid this link energetically for decades, but studies prove that having a settled belief in a creating God who saves people allows those who believe in him to feel they have purpose in significance and salvation, transformation. It deepens their resources for hope. It encourages their perception of the world having meaning. It adds to our capacity for forgiveness. It dissolves bitterness, contains and reduces self-hatred. Religion, Christianity in particular, it turns out is not just good, but it's excellent for one's mental health. Now, this is in direct opposite to the Freudian analysis that Sigmund Freud incompetently and maliciously tried to sell European culture that was all too willing to buy it and believe it, that religious people were neurotics who were on the verge of mental illness, and those who heard voices, which catches the whole mystical tradition, were particularly dysfunctionally ill. The evidence is none of that's true. So what, beyond prayer and pity, is the Catholic response to mass shootings when it occurs? It is not to be distracted by attributing agency to the guns themselves. It's not to be distracted by confusing political overreach of the leftist state with solutions for the distress and malfunctioning of the human condition. The state has never solved anything when it comes to human disorder. Our response should be to offer the deepest compassion to those who suffer, and even, and this is uniquely Christian, to those who inflict the suffering. But to do that, we have to have an informed judgment. And this means the recognition that the most help we can give is to offer people a proper life, a deep life of Catholic sacramental renewal and protection. For this involves being resourced spiritually and mentally, to help people find Christ, to rescue them, and to protect them from the fallen angels who delight in disorder and deception, and are undoubtedly behind some of the worst tragedies, ranging from suicide to the shooting of children in schools. Our response should be a deepening of our own spirituality, our own compassion, our own courage to engage in evangelization. One of the best things we can do is to introduce people to Jesus. Their lives change dramatically. Guns are a symptom. The cause lies elsewhere. And as Catholics, we're better placed than most when it comes to dealing with the dysfunctionality of human beings and its relationship with evil to identify them. Let's get on with that job and not be distracted by the politicization of others who have different motives and different goals.